Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei lashing out at European leaders on Friday, calling them the footmen of the U.S., just days after France, Germany, and the U.K. formally triggered a dispute mechanism written into the 2015 nuclear deal. Tehran announced earlier this month that it would no longer abide by the deal's limits on uranium enrichment, prompting a joint statement Tuesday from the three European powers warning that if the issue of Iran's non-compliance is not resolved through negotiations, Europe would reimpose sanctions on the regime. Behnam Ben Taleblu is a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Welcome. Great to have you here. So let's talk about this European statement. How significant is it in the battle over the nuclear deal?
Well, great to be with you, Paul. It's quite significant because the Europeans have been dragging their feet on Iran policy for a very long time. Whether it's nuclear, ballistic missiles, regional terrorism, or human rights, the Europeans haven't really put their money where their mouth is. And by triggering this dispute resolution mechanism, they're sending a serious signal to the Islamic Republic that they may not be wedded to the nuclear deal forever. And when you compound that with statements from Boris Johnson in the UK, where he's talking about getting a new deal, a quote-unquote Trump deal, then of course the Iranians have to worry how much bigger and broader and more expansive and therefore more restrictive would a new deal be.
Now, Ali Khamenei has said, no, there's going to be no Trump deal. And I guess their incentive might be just at this stage, wait until after the election, see if Trump wins re-election, because the Democratic candidates are all promising to re-enter the deal.
That's exactly right, and it's most unfortunate when America's authoritarian adversaries, be it Russia, China, Iran, or North Korea, are cognizant of these fault lines in our domestic politics and when they use that for their own gain. The Iranians right now understand they don't want to give Trump a card going into the 2020 elections saying that he delivered Tehran to the negotiating table, that his sanctions were effective in record time, which they are and were and remain. So I think Iran is going to try to wait out until 2020, which is why it's crucial for the administration to double down on the sanctions pressure, to replicate the oil sanctions penalties on the non-oil sector of Iran's economy, and really put the squeeze on them because time is of the essence.
And I guess the risks for Iran is that if Europe isn't satisfied now, having triggered this negotiating mechanism, then Europe could join the United States in reimposing sanctions.
That's right. There's a long process basically baked into this JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal, where the Europeans, by triggering the dispute resolution mechanism, get to talk about Iran's non-performance and escalate that crisis all the way up to the Security Council, where the U.S. can then weigh in and then the sanctions can be restored. But right now, the more the Iranians escalate outside the deal, whether in the region or with its nuclear violations, they may actually risk driving Europe even closer and even faster towards the American position. So it's a tough spot to be in for the regime.
All right, let's talk about the reaction inside Iran to the killing of Qasem Soleimani. The conventional wisdom in the West, in most corners of the U.S., is that this will have caused a rally around the regime reaction in Tehran. But there are protests now against the regime in Iran. What's been the reaction inside Iran?
I'm so glad you mentioned the counter-protests against the regime, which happened so quickly after the 3 days of public mourning that the regime in Tehran decreed for this noted terrorist, for Qasem Soleimani. And the speed of those protests and the scale of those protests tell you that the Iranian people are going to continue to use every single opportunity, whether it's the accident, the most recent one being the downing of the Ukraine airliner, or economic issues, as you saw in November, or political issues, as you saw in 2009, to let the international community know that their values and their interests are drastically different from the values and interests of the leaders of the Islamic Republic in Tehran. So we will be seeing more protests more often.
How significant was Soleimani to putting down protests in Iran? We know that he led the Quds Force, which is their foreign expeditionary force, but was he significant in terms of domestic counter action to the protests?
His colleagues and compatriots were quite significant in putting down counter-protests. We know that personally he was very interested in putting down the reformist protests in 2009. You saw many of Iran's political, military, and security officials like Soleimani talk about the threat of reform, but not really. Many Iranian reformists, revolutionaries, people who are dissatisfied with the regime, dislike him anyway, though, because it's his force, the Quds Force, that ruins Iran's national reputation abroad and also spends the money on all these conflict zones abroad. So there are many reasons, if you're dissatisfied with the Islamic Republic, to not like Qasem Soleimani, not least of which because his compatriots are cracking down on you.
Okay. I guess the big picture here is, the big question is how vulnerable is the regime to domestic dissent? You really never know from the outside, but they're under a lot of economic pressure, are they not?
That's right. And the more the regime acts ideologically abroad and spends its dwindling revenues on these foreign wars or foreign adventures, the more flashpoints it creates economically at home, politically at home, to make accidents, to keep preferencing guns over butter. And that, too, can have ripple-on effects for the state and the society, for the chasm between state and society to drastically open and sharpen. So I think the regime could be in something of a defeat loop here in 2020.
Interesting. Behnam Ben Taleblu, thanks so much.